about just sort of some basics around accessing early intervention and special education services, just some of the different sort of information that's helpful to know, things to think about. And then as Christy was saying, sometimes, there is a wait for certain services to start. So we want to kind of help talk about some of parents' rights within this process and things to be thinking about as you're going through it. Next slide. So this slide was our parent partner, Monica, put this together, just sort of thinking about, as a parent, what are some of the signs that you might want to think about early intervention as a possible support for your child. And she noted difficulty with adapting to classroom routines, and that can even be, in an early sort of daycare setting. If the school staff are sort of mentioning that your child is having trouble staying with the group or following some of the activities that they're having. Frustration with communicating wants and needs, which we really saw highlighted with our case presentation today. Limited interest in peer interaction. So again, if a child is not really sort of making their way towards same age peers or showing interest in interacting with them, or if they're in a school or preschool setting and you're seeing that they tend to sort of isolate themselves or prefer playing on their own and that kind of thing. Being fixated more on objects than playing functionally with those objects, difficulties with transition, and some sensory sensitivity. So these are just some of very, many different signs you might notice where you want to consider thinking about getting some additional support in place. Next slide. So one thing I always like to note when we're talking really about any of our service systems, but I think the educational system particularly, we use all these different acronyms, and it's sort of like this alphabet soup. So what I want to note here, we'll talk about some of these today, but as a parent, you should never hesitate to ask for somebody to explain something if you don't know what it means, or to even say to the team, I'd rather you don't use these acronyms. I want you to use the full terminology, because there are lots of them and it can be really confusing, and different states use slightly different acronyms. So don't ever hesitate to ask for something to be explained when you're in a meeting or you hear somebody use a term. So the one we see in red here, IDEA, we can go to the next slide. This is important because this is actually a federal law that really governs all special ed and early intervention services. You can click to the whole slide. Go back one. There we go. So this law really applies to all states. And I saw we have people from lots of different states joining us today. So I think this is really important to know that this is going to apply wherever you live, that all children are entitled to what we call free appropriate public education. And you may hear that term FAPE. And so there is the 0 to 3 early intervention, and then 3 all the way through potentially 21, which is where we're going to refer to this more as special education. Go ahead to the next slide. So early intervention is a term that's used to describe any of the services and supports that might be available. Specifically, we're thinking of that 0 to 3 age range, although sometimes the 3 till kindergarten services are also called like preschool early intervention. But specifically, this is thinking about our really young children who might have any kind of developmental delay or disability that qualifies them for some of these services. And this could include lots of different things, but some of the common ones are things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, behavior support, and many other things depending on the needs of the child. Go ahead. So when we're talking about this birth to 3 system, what's really important here is we're thinking about the child's natural environment, and family should be really involved in services during this age. So, children can qualify sometimes with really young infants if their child might need physical therapy or might be showing some signs of delay really early on. But most often we see maybe as kids are becoming in that 2 to 3 age range that we're noticing developmentally, they're maybe not keeping up with their peers, or we're noticing communication might be delayed. And so once a child goes through qualifying for these services, they're going to be outlined in something called an individualized family service plan. And this is similar to what we'll learn about the IEP a little bit later. But this is really a plan that should sort of highlight what the goals are, what's being worked on, and it should really involve the family as an active partner in all of those services. So on this slide, we have the phone numbers for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware for sort of the intake point for early intervention, but every state will have an early intervention system in place. And usually a simple Google search with putting your state's name and early intervention should bring you right to contact information. What's important to note here with these 0 to 3 services as well is although they are an entitlement for children who qualify, some states will have some sliding scale fees associated with those. Pennsylvania does not. Pennsylvania, these services are all free of charge, but that's something important to just keep in mind as you're looking into these services. And then once a child turns 3, the same law is still going to sort of govern all of the different rights that that child and family have. But we're going to be thinking more about school-based or educationally based services. And so this slide just has some of the terms you may hear. Again, that term FAPE, free appropriate public education. This is a right for every child. Sometimes families might think, well, my child isn't toilet trained yet, or my child needs help, feeding themselves, so they're not going to be allowed to go to school yet. But that's not true. So this law really provides protection that every child is entitled to education, and it should be in the least restrictive environment, meaning that as kids get closer to starting school, we want to be able to have them with, with typically developing same age peers as much as possible. And this law really, again, says that all children with disabilities should be provided whatever supports and services they need in order to learn and make progress. So in order to determine these services, and this is really true for the 0 to 3 system, as well as once a child turns 3, your child will have to be evaluated by a multidisciplinary or educational team, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple minutes. So just high level highlighting what the process is for special education is that we're going to, identify first that we think there might be a need, that we're noticing this child might need a little bit of extra support. And then we go through the process to determine eligibility, which is going to include that educationally based evaluation. And then we're going to develop either the IFSP or the IEP, so those plans that are going to outline services. And then those services are provided, and they should constantly be monitored to make sure we're still offering the right service and that child is making progress with those things. Go ahead. So when we're thinking about, a child who might be showing some delays or who might need some extra support and who can request those evaluations, this can really be by lots of different people. And most of all, I want to highlight that as parents, this is absolutely your right to request that your child be evaluated for services. Sometimes we see that a pediatrician might make a referral for some of those early intervention services, or other agencies who might be working with a family to support possibly other needs can make those referrals for early intervention. And if your child's already in school, the school team can also make this recommendation that they think your child might need some additional services. So once we've made that referral, and we're either going to be, this is 0 to 3 if it's early intervention, or to the local public school, or in Pennsylvania, we have something called intermediate units. This is for age 3, and then up until when they're kindergarten age, we're going to be going to the public school district. And that local education agency is going to make that determination. And this is where, again, we're going to be talking about going through a school-based evaluation, which is going to look at all of these different areas of development. And I will pass things off to Katie.
Thanks. And I'll just add as a quick note, Maria, you just asked a great question about special education services when a child is not in the public school system. The answer is that it is complicated. There is a fair amount of coverage that is still available, but the nuance of where and how those services are provided and to what extent is outlined by your state Department of Education. So since I know you're in Pennsylvania, that you mentioned that at the beginning, I just put a link to that in the chat. If we have time, time, we can come back to this at the question and answer section. Okay, but so to continue from where Susanna left us off, which is where a child has been referred for evaluation, I'm going to talk about what it looks like when it's a school-based evaluation. So here now we're talking about more children who are who are past that early intervention stage, so ages 3 and up. So when we talk about multidisciplinary evaluation, what we mean is that this is a comprehensive evaluation that's going to assess the child in a number of areas with particular attention on areas that have been noted as being of concern. So that will include things like cognitive tests to evaluate the student's IQ, including subscores, which would help determine eligibility, academic assessments for related to instructional content areas like reading, math, and writing, often occupational therapy and physical therapy for things like fine and gross motor skills, sensory and perceptual skills and needs, speech and language or communication for expressive and receptive communication. If there are concerns about the child's behavior, one of those acronyms that you saw up on the earlier slide was FBA, a functional behavior assessment would be conducted. And overall, the results of that MDE or multidisciplinary evaluation help the IEP team determine if the student is eligible for services, and if so, what category they fall under. So next slide, please. One note about determining eligibility is that just because a child has or has had a medical diagnosis of autism does not mean they would automatically qualify as a student who would receive special education services under IDEA. The key terminology within IDEA is that the disability must adversely affect the child's educational performance. And so what we'll note is it may be that a child with autism actually needs no accommodations at all and is performing exceedingly well based on, say, the universal design for learning components that are present in that classroom, the supports they're getting at home or outside of school. It also may be that the child only needs accommodations, but no actual special education services. In that case, the child might not qualify under IDEA for special education, but they might meet criteria to have, it's called a Section 504 plan of the Rehabilitation Act. We won't get into today the differences between qualifying for an IEP versus a Section 504 plan, but we can share resources on that. Truly, if you look up Section 504 plan versus IEP, most of what you will see on the internet is fairly reliable with distinguishing between those two things. Okay, so another note is that a child with autism may actually meet disability criteria in other categories, either instead of or in addition to autism. So it may be that a child who has autism also has a speech or language impairment or orthopedic impairment or a range of other support needs. Okay, so jumping into the IEP or the Individualized Education Program. This is for a child who has been determined to be eligible for special education services under IDEA through that multidisciplinary evaluation. There are three primary objectives when building the IEP, which is done from a team-based approach, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, we want to set the learning goals that are appropriate for the child across one academic year. It's a full year, so the annual year. If the IEP is set in January, it would go from, say, January 2023 to January 2024. If the IEP is set in June, it goes from June to the following June, so on and so forth. In the IEP, the school also states the services that will be provided, and then specifies the accommodations and modifications that are needed for the student to make progress. The big goal is that we always want to say experience access to and make progress in the general education curriculum. Okay, so the IEP, when the IEP is developed, who is on that team? Well, there are a number of required members in addition to a number of optional members. So first and foremost, the parent or guardian, or plural, are required to be invited, and their input is a critical component of that IEP. There also needs to be at least one general education teacher present. There's a small caveat listed in IDEA. I won't go into the detail about if appropriate. I would say in my professional expertise, it is always appropriate for there to be a general education teacher present. At least one special education teacher, the child when appropriate. It's considered when appropriate as soon as that transition, or it's required once that transition section is in place, which federally is by the age of the 16. In Pennsylvania, it's actually 14. There's a lower threshold in certain states. A representative of the public agency, that's often called the LEA, the local education agency, a person who can interpret the evaluation results. That will often be a psychologist, school psychologist, but it can also at times be the special education teacher or the LEA, and then anyone else who has knowledge of the child, that there has been an expressed desire to be part of the IEP team process. Okay, so once a child has been determined to be eligible, the team needs to meet within 30 days of evaluation to develop that IEP. Oftentimes, a draft is prepared in advance of the meeting. However, what's critical is that the draft is not taken to mean that that is the final version of the IEP that you as the family at that meeting need to accept. That's the draft that the school has developed, but this is absolutely a discussion and a conversation about what is best for the student. So it is then reviewed and edited during and after the meeting as a follow-up. Okay, so I'm going to very briefly cover the areas that you would see in the IEP because these are helpful to be familiar with. We could go into depth on each of these, but you'll see at the start of the IEP, there's going to be general information about the student, name, address, birth date, eligibility category, etc., signatures, and procedural safeguards, which are important because you as a family have the right to receive access to information on the procedural safeguards available to you and your child through the special education process. There's a section for special education, special considerations. That's going to get into things I mentioned, like does the child have behavioral needs? Does the child have language needs, etc. The child's present levels of academic and functional performance, that's largely based on the most recent evaluation, but is also based on classroom and other provider information. Information on transition services, again, it must be included by the time the child turns at least 16, younger in some states, but I would encourage the use of that section starting even earlier. How the child will participate in state and local assessments or any appropriate accommodations and alternative assessments. And then the all-important goals and objectives, that includes both short and long-term measurable goals. That's going to guide instruction over the course of the year. Then information on the actual services and supplementary aids and services the child will receive. So that's going to be things like those related services, whether or not the child is eligible for extended school year, any actual practices that are going to be happening in the classroom. And then also information on the child's educational placement. Where will they spend the majority of their day? And there actually is a percentage calculated that is listed there, and it needs to be the child's least restrictive environment. Okay, so you'll see that on that arrow at the bottom, we stopped at the provision of services. We're not going to get into today how you progress monitor and then do a review and even reevaluation. That's content we may return to if there is interest. But for now today, we wanted to talk about the evaluation process and the development of that initial IEP. So I believe I'm turning it back over to Susanna for this one.
Yeah, so this slide was something our parent partner sort of put together, really wanting to emphasize what your rights as a parent are and to really, try to be able to understand and know your rights so that you're able to advocate for your child. So we've seen this term FAPE come up on a number of slides, and it is a really important one because this is really our sort of guiding idea that every child is entitled to get a free and appropriate. And by appropriate, that means whatever the individual needs of your child are. And that is a right to them within our public school system. Also want to just note that the IEP is a legal document. So once that plan or that program is developed with the team and you as a parent have signed giving your permission for those services to start, then this is a legal document. And so if you feel that any part of that isn't being followed or that your child isn't getting the right support, that's something you will speak up about or ask to meet with the team and try to understand what might be happening. Any concerns you ever have about your child's school program, you can bring these to the school team at any time. So as Katie said, the program is good for a year, but that doesn't mean that you can't meet with your school team before that. So teams often meet multiple times during the year as kids either meet goals and make great progress, or need to add new strategies, or have, a new behavior that's come up. And you really are a critical part of this team. And also, as Katie noted, when you're meeting with your school team, you can bring other family members or other therapists who are working with your child who might have important input to share. This really good open communication is really critical here to help make progress. And as a parent, you should always have a good understanding of what your child's working on at school so that you can carry over some of those same strategies. So one thing I also want to note here, as we heard with Christy's case, sometimes kids, particularly within early intervention, might be approved for certain services, and for whatever reason, things aren't being provided. And this can happen for school age kids too, where they may be, the team may agree that they need a certain service or therapy, but for whatever reason, maybe there isn't a provider available. As a parent, it's really important to know what's documented, what your child should be receiving, and keep track of that if they're missing different services. This does happen sometimes, but then your child's entitled to have those services made up whenever a provider is available. So being a really, good advocate and communicating with the whole team that's working with your child is really critical, and it is your right to be involved and to always know what's being worked on, and to have input into the goals and what things you think are really important for your child's success. So I think we have some time now to do some questions and answer, and people can type those into the chat if that's easiest, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can.
And we're going to go ahead and launch the poll. So you might see the poll pop up. Feel free to keep typing questions into the chat, or raise your hand if you'd like to unmute and ask your question. There was a question in the chat that, just if folks aren't able to follow the chat as they're listening, I wanted to bring up to Susanna and Katie specifically. So there was a question from a parent whose child is 5 and receiving preschool special education